managed properly. There were a lot of talks about that and plans to, carry this year's budget to next year. And, all of this is to, all of this transition is to have a unified budget system by April 2026, which, I mean, we are looking at, or we are aiming for a better fiscal discipline. But I think this move draws criticism a lot for prolonging fiscal confusion and, that lack of transparency as seen with, previous extensions, despite government promises of reforms for streamlined single cycle budgeting. But then let's see what this paper has with other stories here. Turaki camp films as INEC rejects PDP ESCO, and this can be found on page 2 of the Punch newspaper, and on page 20 on still on the Punch newspaper, MBA article demand new tax law suspension. So it's a lot of talks about tax this period as well. And Utide Rush, FG orders contractors to keep highways open. And this can be found on page 8, if I'm not mistaken. This can be found, okay, you can see it better now. This can be found on page 9. And the article story can be found on page 30 of the Punch newspaper. Wike promised to hold PDP for Tinubu, Makinde alleges, and that can be found, this story can be found on page 30, still on the Punch newspaper. And then if we go downwards a little, we've seen a lot of talk still from the federal government, and federal government orders takedown of terrorist social media accounts. I think this is what a lot of Nigerian citizens have been clamoring for and have been asking questions. Why would terrorists be using social media freely to post all of their criminal activities, and then we cannot still track them? So I think this is the right move and this is the right step to take. This story can be found on page 7 on the Punch newspaper if you want to have a little context about how they plan to go about it. And then measles death toll hits 111. It's 153, I beg your pardon, in 11 months. Still on page 7 of the Punch newspaper. On page 9, Ekiti domesticates Nigeria Tax Administration Act. Like I said before, a lot of talks about tax, because the Renewed Hope regime is doing a lot with tax. President Tinubu, as we all know, is doing a lot with so many tax reforms, and I guess that's why a lot of talks about tax is coming up, because we are moving to another year. We are planning another year, and yes, this needs to be put or structured properly. And then on page 30, if we look downwards on the page of the Punch newspaper, Fabio Mom's police escort killed by tanker. Sad news there. And now student collapses during test and dies. This is another sad news, and it can be found on page 4 and page 5 if you were wondering why this student have collapsed and died. You can find the story and get more context about it on page 4 and page 5 of the Punch newspaper. And on page 7, I think this is the last story here. Court seizes land linked to Goodluck Jonathan Estate. This can be found on page 7. And okay, I think we have some. Okay, that's the much we can take from the Punch newspaper. Let's see what other newspapers have to, say or have for us this morning. Moving to the Vanguard newspaper. With the biggest story from here, still on tax laws. MBA Article 6 suspension of tax laws. And then the National Assembly too also reenacts 2024 and 2025 budget, ignore Tax Act alteration, adjourns to January 2026, reverses 2024 budget to 561 trillion naira, and then 2025 48.316 trillion naira, and also extends implementation of 2025 appropriation to March 2026. 2026 58 trillion naira bill passes second reading at Senate. So we're still speculating, we're still going around, budget, which budget is going to be finally, approved, because we have a lot of carryovers we need to take into 2026, and a lot of corrections need to be made, as well as restructuring. But that's the biggest story here on, the Vanguard newspaper, and it can be found on page 5 of this newspaper. And going upwards, we're on page 19, Nigeria's net forex inflows rises 12% to $41.73 billion. And on page 10, destruction of PDP dangerous for Nigeria's democracy, said Makinde. Okay, says Wike promised Tinubu to hold PDP for him. All this can be found on page 10 on the Vanguard newspaper, and on page 9, release NAF C-130 aircraft lands in the Gambia en route Portugal for maintenance. NIN CAC numbers to become tax IDs from 2026. This is what the FIRS is saying. So for all the business people, this is for them. It can be found on page 9. The story can be found on page 9 of the Vanguard newspaper. And then if we go downwards a little, we see some pictures, last minute festive season shopping. People are going about. Tomorrow is Christmas, and people are getting ready for it, getting ready for the celebration, cooking, buying chickens, and some complain about hardship here, and we can see people, but you know how Nigerians are, somehow we know how to celebrate. But then moving to another story here, which can be found on page 8, hardship. Federal government gets 52% of federation revenue. Stop blaming governors alone, from RADDA rather. And then on page 37, lack of political will hampering fights against insecurity. And this is Kwakonso speaking. And on page 10, Kwam1 withdraws suit challenging Awujale's succession process. And on page 40, Lukman strike ends Super Eagles slim win over Tanzania. I guess it's this calls for celebration here, and the Super Eagles are keeping to their promises. As they have said, they are going to give each of their contenders 3-3. So let's see how that goes. I guess it has already started. And on page 16, we'll see something of Saki, and 17 Fasan, and on 22 Afe Babalola, and on page 30, Dear Bunmi. If you want to, these are our columns you can read. So if you want to have full details or better context of what those columns have to offer, you can check them out on these pages 16, 17, 22, and 30. But we have to the next paper I have here with me, and the next paper is the Nation newspaper. And the biggest story here, EFCC files money laundering charge against Malami son. Okay, what is this story saying? Okay, still upward, and all this can be found on page 31. This NIN to serve as tax ID, says FIRS. And on page 7, Super Eagles in flying start. I guess that can be found on page 31 as well. I guess, this is something Nigerians have been looking up to. Like I said before, the Super Eagles are keeping up to their promises, and we have our eyes on them, and we hope and wish them the best. And then on page 2, Counter-Terrorism Center boss schools in Mali. Hope I'm reading this correctly. In Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, worsen security in Nigeria. What is happening around the West African region, if you want to have better context, especially around insecurity and coups, and secessions, politics, and the rest of them, you can find them on page 2 of the Nation news paper. And then upwards, National Assembly okays 43.5 trillion naira revised budget. This is the budget we're carrying from 2024 and 48.316 trillion naira, and that can be found. The story can be found on page 3 of the Nation newspaper. And moving to my right, Turaki-led PDP accuses INEC of bias. Agency declines request. Story can be found on page 4 of the Nation newspaper. Uwata appoints aides, page 2. And on page 3, Ekiti domesticates Nigeria Tax Administration Act. And Lagos Ibadan in lockdown. Page 6 of that can be found on page 6 of the Nation newspaper. But that's the much we can take from the Nation newspaper. Now on the New Telegraph newspaper, big story here, INEC rejects Turaki-led NWC cites court's adjustment. That can be found on page 2 and 4 of the New Telegraph newspaper. Okay, still another big story here. NINCAC numbers to become official tax IDs in 2026 says FIRS. This can be found on page 2 and 4 as well. On 4, I beg your pardon, as well, of the Nation, of the New Telegraph news paper. And still on the New Telegraph newspaper, 6 Rivers reps, 2 senators dump PDP for APC. And there are courageous, principled, forward-looking Rivers governor said. Better context of this story, you can find it on page 2 and 4 of the New Telegraph newspaper. Costly Christmas, Nigeria's battle, festive price hikes, 14 and 16 of the New Telegraph newspaper. Christmas is here. People are still battling cost. People are still battling inflation. Better context of that, you can find it on page 14 and 16 of the New Telegraph newspaper, and on 2 and 4, MBA 6 probe of controversies on Tax Reform Act. Over 77% of measles cases in Nigeria more visible with unvaccinated children, the NCDC is saying, and that can be found on page 5. Going upwards, some stories are here rather to Nigerians. Stop blaming governors alone for hardship. Federal government gets bulk of federal revenue. Okay, that's a big talk there, and that can be found on page 2. And on page 4, 114 MDAs failed to render accounts. 40 didn't remit IGR. ICPC is saying, and raising concern over transparency and accountability. Very important that they are calling the MDAs out. I think what needs to be done here is to give better report of what they have done in the year, so we can be able to plan for the next year better. And on page 3 and 6, LG funds, president needs no executive order to compel governor's compliance. Falana is saying, we have taken full charge of Osun local government funds, and that's from Argonne. And on page 7, China Mining Federation rejects Nigeria's infiltration claims. Okay, that can be found on page 7 of the New Telegraph newspaper. And upward, 2026 budget, lawmakers approach threatens January to December cycle as NAS repels reenacts 43.561 trillion naira from 2024 and 48.316 trillion naira from 2025 budgets. 2026 budget of 58.47 472, I beg your pardon, trillion naira passes second reading in Senate. Okay, that can be found on page 2 and 3 of the New Telegraph newspaper. And on page 7, Inter's competition boosts Nigeria's urea export value to 62 billion naira. I'm moving to the next newspaper I have here with me. Okay. The Guardian newspaper. I have the Guardian newspaper here, and fatigue. Investor fatigue. $14 billion infrastructure gaps stall deep seaports renewal plan. This can be found on page 6 of the Guardian newspaper, and on page 3, calls for suspension of tax reforms intensify. Lawmakers okays old budget extension, revised 2026 fiscal plan to 58.47 trillion naira. This can be found on page 3, I beg your pardon, of the Guardian newspaper. And okay, I think the former president's wife, President Buhari's wife, Aisha Buhari, has a lot to say over the past few weeks, and We've been seeing her in the news, regularly, and she is warning, or she warns Tinubu against Buhari mistake of retaining underperformers. Better context of this story, I think this is a very big story here, and it can be found on page 5 of the Guardian newspaper. Still on the Guardian newspaper, FG orders road contractors to remain on site during Yuletide. That can be found on page 5 of the Guardian newspaper. And Makinde opposition cite weak factors say authoritarian drift threatens 2026 polls. That can be found on page 6 of the Guardian newspaper. And Gombe CSOs protest assault demand sack of governor's aide. On page 30, that is where you can find this story. And on page 16, FG misses oil revenue target by 64%, records 3 trillion naira deficit. And on page 4, insecurity, the making of Southeast ghost towns, at dusk. On page 29, Rivers, 2 senators, 6 state lawmakers join APC. And on page 5, lastly, ICPC scorecard exposes widespread failures in federal MDAs. I'm moving on to the next newspaper. I have here with me the Daily Trust newspaper. Tax law still on tax. Big story here this morning is very much about tax and tax reforms and enforcement, and tax laws face legitimacy crisis. This is the biggest story here on the Daily Trust newspaper. And still on the Daily Trust newspaper, kidnappers collected 2.57 billion naira ransom in 1 year, report is saying. Nigeria, and that's not good for Nigeria, I must comment, that's not good for Nigeria. And this story can be found on page 6 of the Daily Trust newspaper and on page 30. Nigeria edged Tanzania in hard-fought AFCON 2025 opener. Nobody came to play, but Nigeria still kept to their promises, and we look forward to other matches from them. Officers missing as terrorists attack civil defense post in Niger. Or in Niger, I beg your pardon. That can be found on page 10 of the Daily Trust newspaper. And yes, still big story here. We've seen the picture taken over the front pages of most of these newspapers as people are preparing for the Yuletide, and it's here already, and people are traveling. A lot of people have been, stopped on their way because of so many things. Travelers at, you can see pictures of travelers at domestic terminals. This is in Nnamdi Azikiwe International Airport. The airport is filled up, and then, we've seen a lot of Yuletide commuters at the area, while motor park as well in the Federal Capital Territory. All these pictures were from yesterday, and we're still seeing a lot more at the Murtala Mohammed International Airport in Lagos. People are going up and about just to meet with their families and, celebrate. What else can we do in this season? But then some stories here, still on the Daily Trust newspaper, page 11, PDP crisis, INEC rejects Turaki-led NWC. And on page 23, National Assembly passes 48.32 trillion naira revised 2025 budget. On page 30, 12 killed in Plateau, Kogi auto crashes. And lastly, on page 6, terrorists using POS machines for ransom collections. And the next story I have here with me, I think this is the last newspaper I have here with me. It's from the Nigerian Tribune. Destruction of PDP, dangerous for Nigeria's democracy. Big story here, and this is what Makinde is saying. Says Wike at a meeting promised Tinubu he would hold PDP for him. I regret backing him in 2023. And then Adelabu doesn't have capacity to organize or your APC for president. All this can be found on page 3 of the Nigerian Tribune newspaper. And on page 6, Nigeria falls short of oil revenue target in first quarter of 2025 budget office reports. That can be found on page 6. And on page 21, Abuja list 2, Kwam 1 withdraws suit to stop process. All this can be found on the Nigerian Tribune newspaper. And 2026 budget, senators insist on implementation as 58.47 trillion naira appropriation bill scales second reading. This can be found on page 2. Ekiti takes the lead, domesticates Nigeria Tax Administration Act. Oyebanji signs Ekiti State Revenue Administration Law 415.57 trillion naira 2026 budget. This can be found on page 6 of the Nigerian Tribune newspaper. NIN becomes automatic tax ID for Nigerians. That can be found on page 5 as CAC numbers emerges official identifiers for businesses. Interesting story we have there. And going upward, INEC rejects Turaki's fraction request for recognition. This can be found on page 8 as the site spending laws suit. All this can be found on page on the Nigerian Tribune newspaper, and on page 21, Tax Reforms Act, NBA calls for suspension probe. And Two Rivers PDP senators, 6 reps defect to APC. This can be found on page 4 of the Nigerian Tribune newspaper. And to get these papers to see what they're talking about, so you can get better context of these stories. But one of the biggest stories we have seen here, or some of the biggest stories we have seen here, first of all, what the National Assembly is saying about the fiscal year, about carrying the fiscal year to the next year and resolving overlapping cycles, and to stop running multiple budgets, so we can be able to track our budgets concurrently, and allowing that clean start for the single budget of 2026. That is why they want to go over it and see where the overlaps are coming from, so that a new budget and a new plan can start from April 2026. And we are also seeing, and one of the biggest stories we are seeing here is also on tax reforms. It's also on tax reforms. We're seeing what they're saying about tax reforms here. A lot needs to be said about tax, as tax faces legitimacy crisis and so many other things. I mean, we see that there was a meeting yesterday held for tax, a tax summit held yesterday, early hours of yesterday, and there were a lot of talks about what Lagos can generate from taxing housings, or taxing house owners, and a lot of things about tax, a lot of things. I know we're going to talk about tax so much next year, but we want to see what next year brings for us. We just hope that the budget is adjusted, they fix all the overlaps, they restructure everything properly. But that's the much we can bring to you on our newspaper review here on Idea TV this morning. My name is Cynthia Bassi, and see you for the Idea Morning Digest.